Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you for joining us and also everyone in the room and our distinguished speakers. I'm Avisham Bojnood. I'm Chief of Information Management Unit of UN Peace Operations, Political Affairs, and Peace Building. It's a true pleasure to welcome you to today's session on 80 years of data on peace and security. We will be showcasing some of the innovative ways the peace and security pillar of the UN is using data to inform decision-making in field operations. So we will be exploring questions like, what can data tell us about the changing nature of peacekeeping and special political missions? So we have distinguished speakers with us, and they will take us through critical trends such as peacekeepers' fatality, and drawing from the UN Peacekeepers Fatality data set that is available on the UN Peace and Security Data Hub. So, and I want to highlight that behind every data point in the fatalities data set is a name, a story, a life committed to peace. Understanding these patterns is not just informative, it is both a moral responsibility and an urgent call to action to ensure the safety and security of those who serve under the UN flag. So drawing on insights from Peace and Security Data Hub, our discussion will uncover how data reveals patterns, challenges, and opportunities that support coordination, strengthen transparency, and ultimately lead to smarter, evidence-based, data-informed decision. Even in politically sensitive contexts, we believe data can be a catalyst for change and a tool for building consensus. So I see colleagues are joining, friends are joining. Thank you all for being here. You will hear two short presentations from Iham and Oliver, who are analyzing data for their day-to-day work. And then we will have an in-depth briefing from Bob Phillips, who's a former chief of staff for MINUSMA, who will share how data helped inform decisions and drive consensus. So before we dive in, we want to make sure that you are all familiar with the UN Peace and Security Data Hub, which is the backbone of many of the insight and processes we will explore today, as it's being explored on a day-to-day basis by our member states and our field colleagues. So to get us started, I want to introduce my colleague, my team member, Iham Al-Maleh. So many of you might have joined my previous session when I've joined with UNV colleagues talking about my story. So I don't want to repeat that, but I want to very much highlight the fact that growing up in Tehran during Iran-Iraq conflict, I saw the first-hand experience of a UN Security Council Resolution 598, a call for immediate ceasefire between two parties, on my life as a child. And that's the case also with Iham. So he has a long history working at the UN, but many of you don't know he was born in Damascus to a Syrian mother and an Iraqi father. He has also first-hand experience as a beneficiary of the United Nations when his family was resettled as a refugee during the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is something you might not have known, and I'm hugely grateful for Iham for allowing me to share that with you. So and that's where his passion coming from. Growing up in Denmark, he specialized in the intersection of conflict prevention and data. Joining the UN as an intern, like myself, in 2016, he has been a champion of the use of innovation and data for the prevention of violent conflict across headquarters and the field. He first, as a policy officer, contributed to the UN World Bank study on pathways for peace. And since, as an information analyst with the United Nations mission in South Sudan, he's been using data for decision-making, planning, and improving our operations. So he's currently working as part of my team. I'm so honored to have him as my team, and he is the lead manager for Peace and Security Data Hub with a great team that he leads. And I don't want to take too much time. So I'm going to hand over to you, Iham.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. It feels, Thank you so much. It's rare you get that kind of in-depth introduction at the UN, so thank you so much for that. Let me share my screen on, and I'll talk a little bit about the Peace and Security Data Hub, why it was established as a collaboration between the DPPA DPO Information Management Unit and the DPPA Innovation Cell. Oh, it doesn't show live content. Let me just reshare 1 second. All right, we try again. You can see now. All right, we can see it in the room as well. Okay, so the Peace and Security Data Hub, the way I wanted to highlight it this time, we have, of course, a monthly training on it for member states, and we use that as well to train our staff in the UN on the use of the hub. It is a new product. It was established in 2021 by the DPA Innovation Cell and Information Management Unit, but it has actually a very long history, and that's what I would like to just highlight, because the data that lives on the hub, by some measures, would be considered ancient, and that is actually because the United Nations has a long history of working with data. It's just only very recently in the peace and security realm that we started publishing those data sets as official records. And that's what the Peace and Security Data Hub is all about. This is a picture from, I think, the 1960s, with UN supporting the tabulation of elections. Another picture, I think, from 73, where we're mapping a ceasefire line. Again, the data in a form of archival format. Voting on resolutions. Every vote is a data point that helps inform our understanding of the status of peace and security today. So, and the other aspect of this data is that it's, of course, all public knowledge. It's public data that is accessible and available to all who wants to put it together and to draw conclusions from it. And we see member states doing that today using Peace and Security Data Hub. So, open data, of course, the Peace and Security Data Hub is the open data portal for the Peace and Security Bill. It has a couple of benefits to work with open data. We normally think of the peace and security realm as, where there's a lot of secrecy, security concerns around certain types of data, privacy concerns around publication of data, et cetera, But when you work with public data, there's actually a lot of benefits to it, to an organization like the UN. Still, first of all, the usual aspects of open data promotes accountability, transparency, and effectiveness, because it allows everyone to be able to scrutinize the work that we're doing at the United Nations. But open data also leverages existing clearance procedures. As I said before, we always publish data. We've always been doing it, but we've mostly been doing it in the form of the Secretary General reports and other formats. Various offices across the UN, whatever your mandate is, whether it's sexual exploitation or abuse, whether you're working on prevention of fatalities for peacekeepers, publishing data can help galvanize a coalition of actors, as we will hear about today. And then finally, it also helps the academic community, leveraging academic community's analytical capacity. I mean, if we had enough analysts to analyze all the data that we have inside the UN, that would be a wonderful world. But in a modern context, we need to leverage those specialized capabilities in the academic community. So when you do data, anyone who's worked in a large enterprise will know this problem. It lives in multiple different formats across different parts of the organization, and sometimes in ungoverned ways. And that creates costs for the organization. Every time we want to analyze our data, we first have to clean it, find out who publishes this, what is the official record, et cetera, et cetera. So that's, of course, a challenge. And our proposed solution is, of course, the Peace and Security Data Hub. That's where all the public data that the UN publishes in the peace and security realm will live and be accessible. So I think there'll be a link in the chat. I encourage everyone to go and explore it. I just want to highlight a few use cases that have emerged over the past few years. The data on the hub provides data for global policy, planning, or evaluating effectiveness. The CPRI Yearbook of 2024 on international security. It uses data from the Peace and Security Data Hub. Institute of Economics and Peace Multilateralism Index, it relies on the Peace and Security Data Hub. And also there was a recent blog post here by the Uppsala University on the missing piece on how to use the Peace and Security Data Hub to strengthen peace and security research globally. That has, of course, over the past few years become much more data-driven. There's also, of course, internal use cases. Various offices use the data they publish to galvanize a coalition of actors around a common baseline of facts. It's been the case for Haiti, the mission there, who published crime statistics to inform the Security Council. The mission in Somalia also does the same. It might also be helpful to coordinate reporting to member states, so everybody can coordinate using the same authoritative single source of truth. But I think the most interesting part of the Peace and Security Data Hub is how other people are using it, not why we're publishing it. But and that's the most exciting part of working on open data, because we see how all of these different use cases are evolving. As soon as you make the data available, other people are innovating on top of it and using it to inform whatever their issue might be. And that's what we're going to hear about today.
Thank you, that was excellent. Please do check out the link that was shared in the chat. So in the previous session that we were talking about carrier, data carrier, digital carrier, there was a lot of questions is that can you be a data scientist working on political affairs of the United Nations? Is that at all possible? And yes, it's possible. And with that, I want to introduce our next speaker, Oliver Durban, who is an Associate Political Affairs Officer in the Security Council Affairs Division of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. With a background in data science and analytics, his work includes leveraging data to analyze trends in Security Council practice and improve access to its decision and documentation. Prior to joining the UN, Oliver served at the German Federal Foreign Office, as well as Interpeace at the Berghoff Foundation, working primarily on peace and security issues and humanitarian affairs. Oliver is joining online. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Avishan, for the introduction and for organizing this meeting. I'm just sharing my presentation. 1 second. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yes, so as Avishan mentioned, my name is Oliver Unverdorben. I'm an Associate Political Affairs Officer with the Security Council Affairs Division in DPPA. And today I want to present a data set and a dashboard that our division maintains, which is on Security Council mandated peacekeeping operations and special political missions. And the data set's currently not on the Peace and Security Data Hub, but it's publicly available on our website with plans to migrate it to the Data Hub. And in my presentation, I first want to give a brief overview of the data set and the dashboard, the scope and limitations of it. Then I want to briefly show you the dashboard itself and what sort of insights you can derive from it. And then I've put together a few preliminary graphs and analytics based on the data set to show some insights that are not visible from the dashboard, but that users can put together based on the data set, in addition to what you can find on the dashboard itself. So getting started, the scope of the dashboard and data set is, like I mentioned, Security Council mandated peacekeeping operations and special political missions. So you won't find here special envoys appointed by the SG if there's no Security Council mandate to it. The data set contains all the provisions of Security Council decisions that have mandated tasks for those missions, and it categorizes the mandate into 21 components. All of these components are found on our website with an explanation of the methodology. In terms of temporal scope, and this is also one of the limitations of the dashboard, the project started in 2019 when we started to collect systematically with one coherent methodology all of the different mandates. So we have data on missions that were active in 2019 or established afterwards. So for all of those missions, we have the mandates dating back to the establishment, but we don't have the mandates. We don't have the mandates of missions that were terminated before 2019. There's also a discrepancy between the dataset and the dashboard. So the dataset will have all the provisions for the missions that have been terminated after 2019, whereas the dashboard only visualizes currently active missions. Another limitation I would like to highlight is that in terms of substantive scope, the dataset only includes reiterated provisions. What I mean by that is that, sorry, it does not include reiterated provisions. So what I mean by that is that when a provision that contains a mandate is merely repeated in subsequent resolutions or other decisions, that will not be part of the dataset. What will be part of the dataset is any provision that has a new task or that has a new element to an existing task. So that brings with it a certain limitation in terms of analyzing and emphasizing changes in the emphasis of the council in mandates over time, since repetitions are not included. So with that being said, so having set the scene here, I would like to briefly show you the dashboard that's on our website. I quickly have to stop sharing my screen here and share my screen from my browser so that I can show you the interactive features. So just give me 1 second for this. And I'll be right there with you again. Is this visible on your side, Ayhan and Abhishan?
Yes, we
Yes.
can see it.
Perfect. So very briefly, the dashboard, as I mentioned, shows all the currently active peacekeeping operations and special political missions. And it allows you to go into more detail either on the mandates of a specific mission or on a specific component of a mandate. So just to show you, we can, for example, look at UNMISS, and when you click on it, you can drill through and get to the details of UNMISS's mandate with all of the different components in which resolutions these components are mentioned, etc. And we can also then look at the component. And when we click on details, we'll get the specific provisions for that mandate component of UNMISS. And this can be very useful, for example, for diplomats or for other researchers, if you want to look at a repository of language that has been used for a specific mission or for a specific component. So just to show you the other core functionality, we can do the same also for a specific component, such as, let's say, electoral assistance. We can go to details and it will show us all of the missions that have electoral assistance in their mandate. And then for each mission, it will also give us a specific resolution. And we can then look at the specific text that contains the mandate. So I go back to my presentation now. This is sort of the core functionality that you can do on the dashboard itself. But now what I also want to show you is just some examples of what additional analysis you might be able to do with the publicly available data by using the data set that's under the dashboard. So just as a quick overview, the data set covers 28 missions that have been mandated since 2019, with 22 of those being currently active. And you can see in this graph here the number of components by missions. And I thought this was an interesting one to look at because you see the big multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations that we all know, with UNMISS having all 21 components, MINUSCA 20, MONUSCO 19. But then I think interestingly, after those large multi-dimensional PKOs, the next larger ones are actually special political missions with UNSMIL, UNISMA, UNAMA, and UNAMI, with 18 and 17 components. Sorry, 13 and 12. It's a bit small on my side. So I think this is an interesting insight, for example, that you can derive from the dataset itself. Then looking at the top components, here I visualize the top mandate components by number of provisions for the PKOs and for the SPMs. So most provisions on PKOs and also on SPMs, if you look at the top three, most provisions relate to international cooperation and coordination, political process, and human rights related, even though the order is a little bit reversed. But then when you look at PKOs, you have somewhat expectedly more of a focus on security related tasks, protection of civilians, demilitarization and arms management, security monitoring. Whereas with the SPMs, there's more focus on political aspects, rule of law and judicial matters, electoral assistance, and support to state institutions we haven't. Looking at the top components by mission, I think this is also interesting to see that almost all currently active PKOs and SPMs have international cooperation and coordination in their mandate, with SPMs also almost all of them having a political process, followed by the others that you can briefly look at here. Just in the interest of time, I'll move on though to the next graph I want to show. So here's just an additional example of what you can do in the data set. So what I did here is to do a quick keyword search of the provisions with some cross-cutting themes: children for children and armed conflict, climate change, and women or women for the WPS agenda. And I looked at the number of references in all the mandate provisions. And what you see here, I want to focus especially on the WPS references. So you see an increase from 2019 to 2020, and then a steady decrease to 2023, with an increase of references in 2024. Here we're looking at absolute references. So one might infer from this that there's been less of a thematic emphasis in the Council on women, peace, and security over the last 5 years, with the exception of 2024. However, if we look at the data normalized, then it looks a little bit different. So focusing on WPS here again, on the blue bar, the references are more or less constant from 2019 to 2021. And then there's actually an increase in 2022, and 2023 goes back to the level of the previous years. So this trend is different than what we have on absolute numbers. So just to explain, normalized here means that we're looking at the proportion of WPS references in mandate provisions relative to the total number of mandate provisions per year. So I think this is just kind of a reminder of the importance of looking at data also in a normalized way to avoid any biased conclusions, because we can see a decrease in absolute references, but we cannot really infer that that means a reduction of thematic emphasis on WPS. And you can look at the same for the other thematic, for the other cross-cutting themes. So just to conclude, some future considerations for our project on field missions. As I mentioned before, there's a number of limitations as to what we can say concerning temporal scope and also thematic scope. So there's considerations about expanding the temporal scope so that we be able to compare the mandates of, let's say, the previous generations of peacekeeping operations to the current ones. And we have those records available, but they've not been validated and are not publicly available. So I wanted to focus on the publicly available data in this presentation. Same for reiterations, including those would allow us to run analysis to compare changes in thematic priorities and emphasis by the Council within the same missions and within one mission lifecycle. I also want to point out that this data set can be used to link to other data sets that SCAD maintains or is going to publish soon. So in my previous slide, I just did a quick keyword search, but we also have cross-cutting data sets on WPS, on children in armed conflict, on protection of civilians. And those data sets can be linked for your own analysis so that you can have a more in-depth understanding and insight on cross-cutting themes without Council practice with relation to the field missions data set. And lastly, also with the reference to this event and IMU colleagues, we are looking into integrating this data set into the Peace and Security Data Hub alongside the other publicly available data set that SCAD maintains. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, colleagues, and happy to answer any questions you might have later on.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for that insightful presentation. Colleagues online, please use the Q&A feature in the chat to ask your questions. Our speakers will be looking at those and responding to your questions. One thing that was really fascinating for me from Oliver's presentation was that the top component of Security Council mandates across UN missions is fostering international cooperation. And I think international cooperation does serve as a cornerstone for building sustainable peace and reinforcing multilateral engagement in conflict-affected settings. So that was really fascinating to see that with focusing on just data. So huge thanks to you, Oliver, for sharing that insightful presentation with us. So we're going to move to our next speakers. So if you look around in the room, I think there's a lot of millennials, Gen Zs around. And that's always something that colleagues talk about. They say, what about senior leadership? How is senior leadership using data, AI, emerging technologies for their day-to-day work? And I say, well, we have senior leadership at the UN who are constantly using this technology, data, and beyond to help their decision-making and planning our field mission operations. And I'm really honored and I have a pleasure of inviting Mr. Bob Phillips to join us today. We're so lucky to have him. So for those of you who don't know Bob, so he's currently an independent consultant, mostly engaged in the internal review of the UN Office of Military Affairs. That was the latest work that he's been doing. He's involved in a lot of other work, and he is also supporting the delivery of Peace Operations Senior Mission Leaders course. He enjoyed 2 careers prior to his current support to the UN. One was he was the first military officer of the United States Army, and the second as an international civil servant in the United Nations. So it's very interesting that Bob Phillips was the first military officer of the United States Army who joined the Office of Military Affairs of UN Peace Operations from 2014 to 2015. He also served as the Chief of Staff with the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, which is called MINUSMA. The mission is now closed, but there's a wealth of knowledge and experience that Bob brings in from his experience in Mali, and that's why in 2017 he co-authored the United Nations Fatalities Report. It's named as Cruz Report, which led to the UN Secretary General's Action for Peacekeeping, some of you might know, A4P initiative. So Bob has a Master of Science in Systems Technology and is an Associated Fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Bob for his insights. Please.
Thank you, Avishan. First, let me, the thrust of today's discussion is a database problem, understanding decision-making and implementation, because before we can solve the problem, we have to understand what it is. So I want to give you sort of an example of that. Now, next slide, please. First, I have a disclaimer. I am not speaking on behalf of the United Nations. I think that's very important. So everything I say is on me. The report I wrote is on behalf of the United Nations. It is public, so you can see it, and it's not a problem. This 2017 Peacekeeping Fatalities Project is just the example I'm going to use to make some points on how you can use data to understand a problem, to build consensus for action, to take action, and then to actually go back and reassess where you are. Okay? And how if you don't have that data, I guarantee you will not be successful. So, next slide, please. Now, let's start with the ill-defined problem. Here's what it is. This happened in 2017. United Nations peacekeeping mission fatalities due to acts of violence, in other words, people are killing you, due to acts of violence are increasing. What should we do about it? That is defined as an ill-defined problem, okay? So now I'm going to tell you a little story about how you take that ill-defined problem and you turn it into a successful plan of action. That's the important thing, using data as the foundation. So first, the project focus. This project was a 6-month project. Its emphasis was short term. That is, at the conclusion of the project, within a year, you wanted to see a reduction in peacekeeping fatalities, now listen closely, while maintaining the full implementation of peacekeeping mandates. In other words, not closing missions, not withdrawing people from the field, but actually maintaining the peacekeeping mandate while you are reducing casualties. That's a big order. The we understand during the study and even today that there are larger political issues that impact peacekeepers, the design of mandates, the consent of parties, but this was not the scope of this project. This project was very practical. Next, please. So please do not look at this in detail. The only point I make, and all of my slides are impression slides. They're meant to convey an impression, not detail, please. They're all detail correct, but they maintain an impression. This is the Fatalities project process, okay? And the process is what the data informs in certain pieces of it. So to look at it, the process is merely the movement from an ill-defined problem to refine that problem so you understand it, confirm your understanding, determine the causes of the problem, look at solutions, obtain decisions, which requires a considerable consensus, develop an implementation plan, implement that plan, and assess the results and adjust. And in this period, I'm going to go through each of these steps, not in detail, but you'll see where I've written in red there, back on this, objective data, that is actually data which you can trust. I'll come to this. And we then eventually, during this process, link it to subjective expertise. Subjective in this context means expertise based on knowledge and experience. Okay, it is not objective. It is based on knowledge and experience. So we have objective data, which is factual, linking to knowledge and experience for purposes of moving forward. Next slide. Okay, so first we have to create a database. We know we have fatalities from acts of violence, and the data was quite extensive. That was within the United Nations. I list only some of the sources, and that ranges from something called the Noticus, Notifications of Peacekeeper Casualty. It's a reporting system, through UN boards of inquiry, which required after fatalities, to investigation reports, to compensation for service incurred death, both for UN civilian staff and for our military and police colleagues. So we actually, we say we, it consisted of myself and at that time a lady named Avishan, who is present right here. We actually went through all of these data sources and basically rationalized them all into a single credible data source. So let's, next slide. And I think most of you who are listening now, you know that in establishing a single fatalities database, which we are going to use for analysis, which is then going to support our consensus building and our decision making, we want to make sure that database was credible and confirmed, complete, consistent and correct. In other words, it had integrity and usable. Usable was critical. So those were the criteria that we built the database on. Next, please. Now, you may assume at this point that we have built the database. We're going to use it. The database, I'm going to show you some elements, not much, but I'd rather show you what it does rather than what it is. And I would ask you as we're going through this was 2017. We did not have artificial intelligence as we know it now. So the question is, maybe at the end, what would we have done differently if we had had the capacity of artificial intelligence that we have right now? And I think we have some good answers to that. So first, we had to look at the problem. And in order to look at the problem, we looked at two levels. The first is a general analysis, where we looked at the history of peacekeeping fatalities from the first casualty in 1948. We then looked at normal patterns and exceptions to the patterns. I mean, we will have casualties. It's part of the nature of the business, but there's normal and then there is exception. And then we're going to look at the differences among the exceptions. Next slide, please. So here it is. This is a simple graph that depicts casualties due to acts of violence in peacekeeping missions from 1948 until 2017. And what you'll notice is, next slide, you'll notice that there are two huge spikes. All right, this occurred in 1960. It was in Congo, okay, when we had well over 100 casualties within a very short period of time. Casualties mean fatalities here. And then we had a period of time, 1992, 3, 4, which was Rwanda, Somalia, and the Balkans, where we had another spike. Okay, and then finally, and this is why the study was being done, look at the left, and you'll see that starting around 2012 and moving up, you had not a spike, but a gradual increase in fatalities over time, which wasn't going up or down, which was normal before. It was in fact going up and continuing up, and that is what provoked the study. That was what provoked it. Although they didn't have this chart when we said this. They said, we know we have casualties, what are we going to do? This is now showing you that it's different. It's different. Next slide. And this shows you the difference. The reaction of the UN to 1960 and to the Somalia, Rwanda, and Balkan fatalities were to close the missions. In other words, avoid the entire thing by not being there. That was the solution. However, there was a sea change in the United Nations in the period on the right, in the 2012 and so forth. And that was a conscious decision to stay and deliver, not to close the mission. So if you stay and deliver, obviously the imperative is to reduce those fatalities. You can't stay and deliver and have ever increasing fatalities. Okay, next slide, please. So that's the general, if you will, picture. And I think if you see that, you begin to realize that this study was focused on a different situation than had existed previously. That's very convincing. All of that is based on absolutely hard numbers. Now, next we want to do a little focus. So now let's just turn to that 2013, 2017. And I'm only going to touch on a few aspects of the analysis. One was looking at the missions that were impacted. The second is the types of appointment. I'll explain that in a second. And the third, which I'm just going to show you some pictures on eventually, are the types of acts of violence. In other words, attacks and so forth, and the weapons that were used, such as explosive devices. Next, please. Now, I'm going to give you two examples, what I want to just mention so you can see in graphic form what we're talking about and the impact of this. First, we're going to talk about missions and then types of appointments. Missions. Next slide. Okay, this is the data that by mission, between 2013 2017, you can see that Mali, Darfur, which is in Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, they and all others, we had a total of 176 fatalities. And look at that lineup. Okay, 81, 27, 23, 13, 8, and 9. And for the DRC, I must note that the study was complete before the 7th December 2017 attack on a place called Semaliki, where the DRC, where MONUSCO suffered 15 fatalities in a single attack. Okay, so if you add that 15 to the 8, you begin to see, next slide, the obvious, and that is that 5 missions were the bulk of the fatalities. And look, all the rest of the missions were very, very small. All right, so where is our effort going to be? It's going to be with those 5 missions. That's where we have the problem, okay? Again, data being used to portray that. Now, if you're the senior leadership of those missions, you know this already, okay? But the thing is, we now can portray it, so we can see it across the board. Next slide, please. Now, let's look at this, types of appointments. Okay, in the United Nations, there's a lot of appointments. And I said, oh yes, 195 fatalities. I think I said 136. 195 during the period of time, 13 to 17. So we have civilians, and that includes our national and international staff and our UN volunteers. Okay, it also includes people like consultants and so forth, people who are not in uniforms. We have UN police and we have military. Now look at this statistic. Look at this statistic, and I'll give it to you in a much more graphic form in a second. But of the 195 fatalities, 5% were civilians. 5% were UN police. 90% were military. So I think we begin to see right away where we're going to be headed. And I can tell you, just to not belabor this point, but the civilian and UN police are under something called the UN Security Management System, which is effective, and that is why their fatalities were very low. The military are not under that system. They are much more exposed. Next slide, please. Now look at this. This is how you show this to senior people. All right, and I'm going to come back to this. But look at the light green on the left, which are the military, and look at the blue, the dark blue, which is the military on the right. And it obviously tells you right away where your problem is. I think this is very simple to see, but you know, nobody had figured this out until we did this. Next slide, please. Okay, so we now focus on the military. So in the UN military personnel are deployed either as individuals, that's military observers and liaison officers, staff officers, or as military units, so infantry battalions or aviation units or medical units and so forth. Okay, interesting enough, having gone through the database and analyzed it, we found that, as I said before, 90% of the 195, that's an incorrect number, fatalities due to acts of violence were military personnel. But here's the most important thing. Almost all, 98% of that 90% were people within military units. They were not military observers. They were not staff officers. They were not liaison officers. They were not military advisors. They were people serving in units. And why is that? It's because they are at much higher risk, much higher exposure. So now you begin to see that the study is shifting towards the problem, which is 5 missions, military units. Okay? So you see we're beginning to refine this problem to something that is actually understandable. Okay, next please. Now, I'm just going to show you this. This is activity. So you'll see on the left, offensive operations, demonstrations or riots, quick reaction forces, carjacks, murder, okay, and so forth. This is a variety of activities where fatalities occurred, okay? And then on the right, you see the types of weapons that cause people to die, all right? So you can see guns were the big one, and then improvised explosive devices of all kinds were the second. Mines, another explosive device, were the third. And then rocket propelled grenades and so forth. So you begin to see that guns and explosive devices, IEDs in particular, were the major killers. So we refined down that problem. Okay, next please. Now this is the problem as now we have refined and we understand. We got 5 missions as listed there. Darfur was closing, so that became a less of a problem. It was closing because of normal reasons, not because of this. Military units account for 90% of fatalities, of which the majority are in military personnel account for 90% of the casualties, of which the vast majority are military units. Convoy escort, camp attack, and patrols are the places where you're most vulnerable. Guns, VBIDs, and improvised explosive devices, mines are the greatest killers. And as I said, the highest fatalities were in military units due to their higher risk. So that's the problem. And I think even the people in this room who may not have served a day in the military understand that's a problem. Okay? Next, please. Now, this is where it gets to be very interesting. We are going to leave objective data now and move to subjective, meaning expertise based on knowledge or experience. And we're going to link this analysis to this expertise. And we're going to do this for the purposes of 2 things. Three things. One is to confirm the problem. In other words, the problem as we described it, is that the problem the way our experts see it? The second is to build consensus for action. Okay? And the third is to get decision. And the fourth is then to develop a plan to execute that decision. So all of this goes back to the data. Next, please. So in this case, at this point, I was the only member of the team. Sean had left me. And so I went to the four highest risk missions. Remember, Darfur was closing. SOCAR, Central African Republic, Congo, Mali, and South Sudan. And what I did was I engaged the senior leadership, meaning the head of mission and everybody else, and I'm going to show you this, and key staff to confirm our data analysis and the problem. Is this the problem as you see it? And to build consensus for action, okay? So that is the basis then for looking at what causes this problem. All right, so it's very important to start that consensus building early. Now, if you were a senior person and I showed you those graphs that you just seen, there was no discussion. They got it. They internalized that very quickly and said, this is the problem. And then at that point, you have the beginnings of a consensus for action. Next, please. So these are the types of people that I spoke with. This is just a short list, but heads of mission, deputies, force commanders, police commissioners, directors of mission support, the security advisors, of course. Next. And then this is some of the key staff, peacekeeping, intelligence, security risk management, and a part of the security people, operations people, force protection, medical people, casualty evacuation actors, okay, because many of these fatalities died while they were being evacuated, okay. Board of inquiry officers, because they do the investigators, and others as necessary. That's just to give you a sense. Okay, these are the people we want to confirm the problem and then to help us build that consensus. Next. Now, we're at the end of a 3-month, we're 3 months into this, and it became obvious to us that we needed to engage a higher level of subjective expertise. All right, and this was for the purpose, once again, of obtaining consensus from higher levels in the UN, that being the Secretary General. All right, so we went through a little quick process of who was the best placed person to do this. And the answer was we needed a senior and very experienced force commander because of the military problem, okay, who had been very successful in high-risk environments, in this case, Haiti and the Eastern DRC. And that person was General from Brazil, Carlos Alberto dos Santos Cruz, who is a good friend of mine, and who was at that time serving as a state secretary in the Brazilian government, having retired from the military. Right? So we asked the president of Brazil to release him to us for a period of 3 months, which happened. Then he, I, and another young gentleman, we went on a second visit to 2 missions, Central African Republic and Mali, but in this case, including their field operating sites. So not just the senior people now and the staff, but now the people who are operating in the actual field sites to, again, determine causes, build consensus, and develop recommended actions, okay, to lower fatalities. Okay, so next slide. Next slide. Okay, now, in this case, as I said, we saw many of the same people again. However, in this case, we also dropped down and went to various regional offices and military sector commands, police regional commands, and we had the same discussion. And from this, we began to develop, and this is your subjective expertise. Given the problem, what are the causes and what can we do to fix it? Next. And we're almost to this. Now, this all went into a report, okay, called the Cruz Report. There's a picture of it. I personally took the picture of that young soldier on the front who did not want me to take his picture. You can see he was quite irritated. I think I got permission after I took the picture so he would not get agitated. And the title of the report, Improving Security of United Nations Peacekeepers, we need to change the way we're doing business. All right, short known as Cruz Report, because in the UN, the senior person gets to put their name on it. Okay, and this report, which is available online in the open public, okay, it gave the analysis of the problem, which I've described to you, to include the data, the causes, and it recommended actions to prevent or mitigate each of the cause in 18 areas. And I just gave you some examples. Mindset of leadership, training, equipment, procedures, and so forth. That was what the report did. Next. Okay, this report was briefed by General Cruz and myself to the Secretary General on 19 December 2017. And remember that consensus building? The consensus was there. The approval was approved immediately by the Secretary General, and he developed implementation. Next. Because we had consensus to include within the departments, the DPKO at that time, Department for Peacekeeping Operations, was tasked to develop an implementation plan, which was done between January and February of 2018, so in less than 2 months. And that plan was called Action for Peacekeeping, A4P, launched by the Secretary General on the 28th of March 2018. And now for the final thing. We now implement that for 1 year. Next. And where are we? Okay, look what happened. Look at the right. In 1 year, a 50% reduction in fatalities because of a concerted effort with the consensus not only of the missions, but of the member states that actually had to take a lot of action to strengthen how their units were in the field and how they operated. So that is how you get from data to problem definition, to confirmation of the problem, to consensus building, to senior, at the most senior level, decision making, to implementation, and then go back to the data and look at that again. And where are we? Now we know where we are. With that, I will close. Okay, next slide. Okay, with just a couple of thoughts, and then I will stop talking. And that is, I only wish that in 2017 we had the AI that we have today, because all those charts and graphs that I did, first of all, they took a long time because they were done in Excel, and that is a very painful process. Okay, we had other software but Excel proved to be the easiest to use. Today, of course, we can develop the database, and this is my point. Before we apply the AI, we develop the database. Then we train AI on that database, and then we can do whatever we want. It all happens very quickly. Okay, so that's it. And then the other thing is, of course, we can now use AI to actually assist in our not only in our presentation of the data analysis, but also actually in the analysis of costs. Okay, but just be very careful. Remember that subjective expertise cannot be missing, because AI, depending upon how it's used, will use all sources, good and bad. So we have to be very careful about that. And the last thing I have to say, which is not so positive, and that is that after this was over, we had great success for about 4 years in keeping those casualties down. However, unfortunately, within the organization, we did not really identify a clear person or organization that would be accountable to continuously monitor this and to basically repeat the process. So the point is, if you have a process like this, which produces these kind of results, don't forget it. Every now and then go back and redo it. Okay, and we didn't do that. Avishan, back to you.
Wasn't that excellent? I mean, I had as Bob mentioned, I had the honor and pleasure to work with Bob on this study, and it was really fascinating to see, as Bob highlighted, how data can be used to really respond to a hypothesis, to respond to questions, to identify problems. And I call this the martini glass approach that Bob highlighted. You start big, you look at all the issues, and then you start seeing those trends, and then you start diving deep, and then you start asking questions. And that's when the subject expert matters need to come in to answer those questions. And then you can use that as a way to communicate to the senior leadership, build consensus between the UN, with member states and outside, and find solution to a problem and get the resources that are needed. So this is really fascinating. And I love the point that Bob highlighted about generative AI. That's right. If back then I had ChatGPT, I would have just used ChatGPT to upload the data there, do the analysis, and provide those data visualizations to Bob within maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's something that I want to highlight, that for all of you, with Peace and Security Data Hub, the data is AI ready, as Bob highlighted. The data is reliable, is high quality, is cleaned up, and it's normalized, and you can use ChatGPT to analyze your data. So you upload a CSV file there to ChatGPT, and you can start asking questions in natural language. So that's something that I want to highlight. If you are interested in any of the data sets in Data Hub and you want to analyze this, feel free to use ChatGPT. I don't want to take too much time because I know there are questions. If that's okay, I'm going to start with questions in the room. If there's a question. Yes. Okay, wonderful. So maybe before asking the question, if you could introduce yourselves, and then we'll start with the question. Thank you.
First of all, it's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights. That was very helpful. My name is Akmal. I work with DBB, BBSO, and I'm aspiring data
And
analyst.
what is BBSO? Maybe you could mention.
Yeah, of course, it's Peace Building and Support Office. And we're currently working on developing our own platform. So it kind of brings back to the point and the questions that I wanted to make. And I believe it goes back, because I see it as a pain point. So what you were mentioning before, it's an existential question. You probably don't have answer for that. But given the current ecosystem, right, and even with the development of Gen AI and all the tools that currently have that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago, I feel that there are so many platforms, silos, and systems that don't really operate well together. And I wonder if there's a chance to create some sort of a strategy within the UN and who knows, like maybe even beyond, like bring together all the NGOs. And now that I'm saying it, I recognize it's not really a question, it's more of an existential perspective, I guess, a statement that I drew it from our discussion. Anyway, I really appreciate it once again.
Thank you. Bob, do you want to share
Yeah,
something?
I'll use the fatalities as an example of what you're talking about. We don't actually have to link all those compensation and all that. What you have to make sure is that the foundation data that everybody is using,
Yeah.
okay, is actually accurate and correct and is validated. Now, the problem is that in some of the reporting systems, there's a bit of subjectivity. So we can say one person named this was killed. That's a fact. But then the thing is how, when, where. And now we get to sometimes some very blurry stuff, which has to be researched.
Mhm.
And therein is your problem, because that begins to take a fatality, which is a data point. Okay, and you cannot basically group it unless you have similar grouping patterns. So the one thing we need to do is really to make sure that the reporting is absolutely consistent. And if it's not, then you have to rigorously go back
Right.
and get it redone so you know. And if you do have uncertainty, you can mark it uncertain. Okay, so you can deal with that if you know. So that is very difficult. And even now, that is a problem. It is a problem. The quality control is a problem. And if I had my way, every mission for these types of reports, you would have a quality control person whose sole job would be to make sure that data was accurate, because everything is based on that.
Right.
If you get that wrong, all the rest of this is wrong.
It's not working, yeah.
So your point is correct. But you don't have to join everybody. You have to make sure that what you've got is
That's
good.
right, yeah.
I mean, ideally, you'd like to join everybody.
Right.
I can't even imagine the expense and the time that would take you.
Thank you. And I see Oliver, please, grateful for your insights on this question.
Yeah.
Or comments.
Yeah, sure. Maybe just 2 quick points. So one, in terms of systems speaking to each other, I think one limitation that I've observed is that I think especially several years ago, when there wasn't so much of a data mentality, let's say, the data sets would be tailored to the specific use case. So if we say the field missions dashboard, the use case was to have a repository of language of missions that are currently active. So the data set would be that, and that's publicly made available. However, it's actually a subset of a larger data set that we have internally. So now when I want to do additional analysis or develop systems for a different use case, I can't do it because I only have a subset available. So I think that for those systems to work with each other, it kind of requires this change in mindset of how does the data need to be formatted and presented so that we can do as broad as an analysis as possible. And I think that's where IMU has been very helpful in terms of advising substantive teams on how to go about it. And the second point on data quality control, I think it's just because there was a discussion on AI before, I think the quality control is a really important aspect when we think about the use of AI in data analysis. Because let me just go back to the field missions data set. Here, the categorization is done manually by our team. I can pretty easily develop an unsupervised machine learning algorithm that draws out main themes from the provisions, and those will look very similar to the categories. But there will be no level of validation here. So if we put something out as SCAD, as DPPA, that step of quality control is essential, especially when AI is used in the analysis. That's the points from my side.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And IHUM, what are your thoughts?
Systems integration is a pain in the neck for all of us, especially for IMU. So I just wanted to highlight 2 things that we're working on in support of both the injuries data and how we can leverage the peace and security data as kind of a foundation for a lot of this. The injuries, fatalities is one aspect, one dimension of a casualty. There's other types of casualties, including injuries, illnesses, when people get repatriated, other types of casualties, where we're facing the exact same problems. And I just want to highlight that the nitty-gritty work of matching different categories, advising systems owners, consulting with everybody, because that is a pain in the neck. It's hard, grueling work, but the benefits are tremendous. Once it's done, it can create a tremendous value for the organization. And I think we need to be able to speak about the value of that kind of integration. And the second point I wanted to highlight is that modern enterprises have moved more towards mastering data. So there are certain core data sets that other data references, and that's where what we hope to publish on the Peace and Security Data Hub. So then we have a list of missions. That's the authoritative list of missions with start and end dates. Any system across the enterprise that is built using that will be able to seamlessly integrate with other parts. Yeah, exactly. So that's our goal. But is we are kind of at the beginning stages of early stage of a data. If you imagine a data maturity model, everybody has now put together their own dashboards. That's great, and then as we mature, we'll get better at this.
Yeah, I'm just mindful that we're right at 11 a.m., which is the end of our session. But we will answer a few more questions. I see also a question in the chat. So if colleagues need to jump on another call, I fully understand. But we will stay maybe a few more minutes to answer the questions. Thank you.
I was just gonna, maybe there's, just to put it out there, maybe there is no answer, but do you think there's like a root cause of these organizational impediments, whether they be misaligned like incentive structure or entrenched organizational philosophy, like that prevents this agility to be for change and to modernize?
I'll start with that. All right. This type of mindset change is only going to occur when the most senior management has the same mindset. All right. So one of the things that we have is that we're in a transition in generations, if you will. I don't subscribe to the theory that each generation is unique in itself. Okay. Depending upon the time in history you come along, you have characteristics because of what time you're born. But I will say that having been chief of staff of not one mission but two, I will tell you that if the senior management does not support, for instance, this type of data rigorous integrity, then it won't happen. Mm-hmm. It just won't happen. And the problem is in missions and large missions, you have many different sources of data which have to be watched, which is very difficult. And in smaller missions, strangely enough, you have less, but you have less resource. So either way, you have a problem. So until you have a mindset that says this has got to become normal. I give you an example. Political affairs people, when they write reports, okay, they really look at those reports carefully to make sure that what if they know what they're saying is true, it's that way, and if it's not, they say it's not. We need to do the same thing for data. I mean, that's the mindset we have to have. Is that it's so important to get it right. If you get it wrong, to fix it is so hard. Going backwards, it's so hard. And I can tell you, we did this. Think about looking at these reports from 1948 and how many of them were not correct. And you have to go back and say what really happened. And I'll give you an example. We had a civilian who was killed in a criminal attack in Cote d'Ivoire. Right? But it was recorded as a terrorist attack. No, it was a crime. It was a robbery. It wasn't a terrorist attack. But you see, you begin to skew your data because now we say terrorist as opposed to robbery. These are two different problems.
Yeah.
I have a last.
Okay. Maybe if that's okay, we take the question on the chat and then go around.
Yeah.
Yes. So the question in the chat is from Tyler from UNMAS, who is a data analyst, and it seems like Tyler is analyzing ID threats and looking at mitigation measurements, but in a data-driven manner. And Tyler is mentioning that it's not just the number of casualties that they're looking at, it's also the general type of attacks, landmine, ID, drone attacks, and is wondering what data set is the best data set to be used for this type of analysis. What would be a good starting point? So maybe I'll just say a few things here, and then Bob, of course, please, you also contribute to this question. I think, Tyler, it would be good if you have a discussion with UNOCC. They collect some of this information. There's, depending on the mission and depending on the taxonomy of the event, you might be able to work with UNOCC to get a description of events around attacks on UN personnel via IEDs or mine. But also, the question is that if you're looking for civilians that were the civilian casualties, that data might not be in SAGE, and that won't be in Nauticus. And I think that would be a good question to see who would be the best authoritative owner of that data set. But in terms of attacks on peacekeepers, I think it would be best if you talk to UNOCC. Yeah, but maybe our protection of civilian team in the mission, if you reach out to them, they might be collecting the data on attacks on civilians. But Bob, any thoughts from your side?
This is a tough one because in many cases, the missions themselves know, but they don't transmit it. So one of the things you'll have to do, Tyler, is to contact the missions and see what they have in the missions, okay? Because much of that is not in the headquarters, I guarantee. And if they have that data, it is very susceptible to just disappearing if you don't get it. So that would be one, and in particular as it revolves IEDs. Of course, Unmasked itself has its own databases because it has teams in the field. And where you have teams in the field, they have a pretty good sense of what this is. So this is exactly the kind of question we started with the fatalities study, was what are the sources and where we have to go to get it. And so before you do anything, you should definitely spend some time on that and contact the people on the ground to see what they have. And I agree with Avishan, UNOCC, those and Office of Military Affairs in particular, right? Because they receive daily reports from the field, and many times those daily reports only remain in the Office of Military Affairs, so nobody else knows what they say. Yeah, so it's just this is a tough one. Be prepared for quite a research project.
Thank you. And Rania, I see you have a question in the chat, but
I was thinking the questions to you, Oliver. In your second or first dashboard, you have like a components list for indicators. And do you have like reasoning behind why you chose those indicators, or if you can answer that maybe?
Yeah, sure. Just real quick, this was put together by political affairs officers in SCAD based on their expertise of council practice. So it's an exhaustive list of components, and then there's certain rules according to which certain provisions are attributed to one or another. And the specific methodology is on our website if you want to have a look at it. And maybe just to emphasize that it doesn't reflect explicit council practice or positions at the level of interpretation from SCAD colleagues.
thank you. Thanks, Oliver, as well for your response. Maybe two more questions. The first one from the chat, and then we'll have him actually ask his question. So, Pratyushan, thanks for your question that you typed in the chat. Maybe I'll ask this question, Anham, if you could respond, because it's about the hub. Are there any compelling user stories of individuals who have used data sets from the Peace and Security Data Hub to uncover eye-opening insights?
So that's a great question, and I think that there is there's quite a lot. I just don't know where to start with that. Maybe overall, we can just say that the production of knowledge or data and information in the format that we have it on the Peace and Security Data Hub, precisely like Bob Phillips outlined, is actually a way of building consensus on some of the most basic things that we have within the organization. Even stuff like where are we active, who's contributing, what troops, where are they active, and what are the fatality rates, etc. I think one of the most compelling stories I've heard has been because we publish our data as APIs, which means that anyone can use the data and plug it into their own internal reporting or dashboard systems. We noticed that some member states of the Security Council use that to routinely update their senior leadership about which countries are contributing troops in what regions. And that goes into automatic briefings at the senior most level in ways that we don't even know. So like the White House or other beyond central executives all over will use that to have a background understanding of who's contributing what to which peacekeeping operation. And I think that raises the prominence of the sacrifice that the peacekeepers are making when they put their lives on the line for peace. I find that very compelling. data scientists all over the world are using it to measure the impact of our presence, whether the composition of the force matters. Does it help women to have more women as part of the military component? Does it help with the reduction of violent incidents? All of those studies are suddenly available because we are able to publish this data. But as I said, we're kind of at the early stages of a maturity model, and I think the more interesting part of this question is what the future might bring, how you might use the data for your own types of research or answer your own questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ayhan, for sharing that. Before the last question, if there's any question, you are more than welcome to add your question in the chat, in the Q&A section, and we will share it with the speakers and we'll get back to you with a response. So with that, the last question, please, Tianchi.
My name is Tianchi. I'm working with IMU. I'm also responsible for researching the injuries data problem. And we are talking about data today, but I think the problem sometimes is more than data itself. Data itself cannot speak for them. So we need human to, I'm really interested in the interactions between the Secretariat and the member state, especially when you're doing your research and also take the initiative for that research. So I'm curious, everyone can see that there was a surge in the fatalities, but I'm curious, is the member state to ask Secretariat to do something, or is we take the initiative to do that? And also follow-up is how do we just interact between these two? I believe there must many back and forth, and what's your biggest challenges during that process? I believe it won't be the technique issue like Excel's.
Yeah. No, the answer was the Secretariat, member states were concerned, no question, because you can see the casualties. I didn't put up a list of casualties by nationality intentionally, but the member states were very concerned. Okay, so this is why the Secretary General directed the project. He may have done it on his own anyways, but it was clearly concern there. All right, so that's number one. Financing for this project was actually provided by a member state. Okay, so I'm not going to mention who, but it was provided by a member state. Okay, the member states during this project, during all phases, okay, to include the initial one, I personally, and General Santos Cruz and myself, we personally discussed with many member states here in New York, okay, to permanent missions, and in the context of the military and police advisors community, which is an organization here which brings all those people together. Yes, we did seek their views because they are also subjective experts in many times. Okay, so we sought their views, and that is also part of the consensus voting. Right? And there's this other thing. Some member states, for instance, when the study was obviously known, it wasn't a secret. So some member states were looking for a very academic report, and we determined that was something that would be very, very interesting, but would not be particularly useful in addressing the problem quickly. Right? So we made a decision to divert from a typical academic approach to a very practical approach, and that was pretty much made when we determined what the problem was. Military units were the big problem, because then it became much more doable. And so there was some criticism after the report on its academic nature, which is fair, but there was never any intention at a certain point to pursue an academic report. Okay, and this we needed to get the casualties down, and so that's what we did. And lastly, almost I would say probably a majority of the actions recommended were actions from member states. So without their support, this would not have happened. And little things like the type of vehicles that you have in this area where you're getting blown up, if we change the vehicle, the people will survive. Little things like that. And they did this. They did this. I mean, I'll give you an example. Bangladesh did, in fact, change their vehicles and their casualties went. Okay, so this was meant to be very practical. Without member state support, it would not have happened. So in every aspect, and if you're involved in these kind of projects, and it is of interest to member states, then be interested in talking to member states.
Thank you so much.
No, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent response. I know we can be here and having this discussion for hours and hours. Really appreciate everyone who joined us online, also in person, for your engagement. If you're interested in the AI discussion, I'll share the link for a session that we will be having. I'll be involved with UN Global Service Center on an initiative called AI for All. So feel free to join us on Friday. We will also be having excellent speakers in that session. And let's continue the discussion, and thank you all for joining. If there are any questions, please do feel free to reach out. And I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. And again, happy UN 2.0 week to all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we muted?